about a quarter to 7 in the morning here in Kharkov. I got up at like around a little before 5 a.m. and just started reading my news feed. I can't sleep more than 5 hours, 4 hours here in Kharkov. Sometimes during the afternoon, I'll take a nap for an hour or so. And sorry if I sound a little bit low, because there are people sleeping here. I was reading my feed, and I had no intention of doing an early morning stream. I was frankly hoping for an early morning lay, but I read something that just so pissed me off and revealed a lot. It just revealed a whole bunch. Mhm. I mean, like the Joycean epiphany kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I read an article by Niall Ferguson, who is a Scottish-British historian. I think he's Scottish. He's slightly older than I am, and I have read him. I read his book on the First World War, but I don't remember any of it. It was a phase that I was reading a whole bunch of stuff about the First World War, and his book was just sort of like a mainstream intro kind of thing. Nothing particularly remarkable about it, or not that I recall at any rate. And I also purchased, but have never got around to reading, a book of his on the Rothschilds family, which seemed really interesting. But for some reason, I just never got around to reading it, and I have it in storage in Chile. And so here in Kharkov, I ain't gonna be reading that anytime soon. But anyway, I know who he is. He is a guy who writes a lot of articles in mainstream publications. He's a mainstream historian. He is, Oxbridge kind of guy. He works, I think, at Harvard or maybe Stanford. I actually don't know. I don't care. He's he is a courtier of the regime. Mm? And this is something interesting because I read this article of his that he posted in Bloomberg, and I read it from Zero Hedge. And what's interesting is that Warren Buffett had a really great saying. He said, "You only find out who's swimming naked when the tide gets pulled out." Mhm. Or it's only when the tide recedes that you see who's swimming naked. Yeah, something like that. Words to that effect. That visual that when the tide shifts, yeah, and the tide recedes, and all of a sudden you realize who's on the ball and who's not. And see, you got to understand that historians matter because they shape our perceptions of the past, our collective past, especially in our industrialized society. We have to be paying strict attention to historians so that they can give us a clear story so that we can move forward through life. Mm. But it's very important that historians give us an accurate appreciation of the past, warts and all. Especially the more sophisticated histories. I mean, it's perfectly fine, for children's histories, like in the, second grade or whatever, to, tell the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, I will never tell a lie, that whole story. That's actually constructive, okay? It's educational. It gives a sense of that honesty is so important in our culture. Yeah, perfectly fine. I'm talking about the American culture. But you need historians who give you accurate information. And here's a key issue about historians. And I'm interested in history because, of course, I studied history. I studied history and philosophy, like a dual track at Dartmouth. And so I pay attention to historians. I mean, not that close. It's not like as much attention as I pay to, say, for instance, horses at the track or something, but I pay enough attention, and I sort of pay attention to Niall Ferguson, where he's at. I mean, that's why I read this article of his. And you see, a historian, because of his historical knowledge, the baggage that he carries naturally because of his occupation, he ought to be somebody who makes a great analyst for contemporary events. He ought to be able to look at the contemporary situation and be able to give extremely good analysis, not because he's so wise, but because he has such a wealth of information that he can compare and contrast the current situation to events from the past and say, oh yeah, this looks like this and this looks like that. And what's so important, of course, is that a historian ought to be telling the truth. He ought to be making accurate observations of reality, okay? and it is a key issue. If he's not making accurate observations of reality, if he's saying things to please his masters, then we're in a horrible fix. And I would argue that that's the problem with most of the chattering classes in the current regime of the West, Western Europe, and the United States. I mean, that's why I have no intention of returning, by the way. When this war is over, I'm moving. I'm moving east. Because at least in Russia and China, they're not afraid of looking at the truth. You know, they might be repressive in some ways, but hey, there, I'm back. I hope I'm back. Okay, so the bullshit and the lies come from the fact that it started with everybody being too polite. I started seeing that in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s. Everybody way too polite to tell the truth. And in the 90s, it became political correctness. And now we're just, our entire epistemic outlook is based on lies. I mean, we are so detached from reality. I mean, this isn't merely coherentism. This is just detachment from reality altogether. Okay. Anyway, I want to talk about Niall Ferguson, because Niall Ferguson is just so incredibly wrong, and it's important to understand why. And it's important to realize that he's just spouting lies. And he actually, I suspect, knows the truth, but doesn't have the courage to speak the truth. And so he has tailored his message to flatter his audience. That's what I perceived in his article. And to tell you the truth, after this article, I kind of like despise the man. I cannot take him seriously, and certainly not on a moral level. Because how can you take seriously anybody who lies? Because all evil comes from lies. And if Niall Ferguson begins by, is the source of lies, then only evil will come from his words. So on a moral level, I believe he must be rejected. And I'm going to go through this article because he lays out 7 points about the current conflict in Ukraine, which for obvious reasons I know intimately. And I'm going to go through them, and I'm going to explain why he is wrong on every single point. This is going to be a fairly short stream. I hope it's short. You know, I don't want to waste your time. I really want to get to the point and just like nail this fucker, because he's just so wrong. I mean, it's not merely that he's wrong, he's lying, and he knows it. And that's why it's interesting. Okay, so the first thing you notice when you read this Bloomberg article is that, he compares the current situation to 79 or 39. How do we feel that we're close to World War III, blah, blah. And here's something really interesting. And he talks about his good friend, Steven Pinker. Now, this is a deliberate move. This is to establish that he is in good with the crowd of the narrative, the liars. The liars that are the foundation, you realize, of the empire of lies that is the West. Okay, so he puts out his bona fides of how he's good friends with Steven Pinker, and they talk about some stupid bet that they're supposed to have made. And then, where is it here? Oh, I skipped. Oh, earlier on. He talks about how when he was a teenager, he read Sartre. Right. As a teenager, I'm reading off this thing. As a teenager, I avidly read Sartre's trilogy about French intellectuals on the eve and outbreak of World War II. Now, that claim, first of all, it's put into, I believe here, the third paragraph of his post to establish his intellectual bona fides. You know, he read Sartre when he's a teenager. Well, so did I. And I can tell you that he would never have read those books. He's referring to the book, The Age of Reason. He never would have read them. I know, because I was a brainy kid too, and I'm roughly his age. I'm a little bit younger. You would have read Being in Nothingness and Nausea. The Age of Reason? No, you wouldn't have read it. Much more likely, you would have read Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man. In fact, Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, Siegfried Sassoon's memoir of the pre-World War I period, is actually much more apropos to the current situation, but that's just taste. But you would never say that you had read The Age of Reason by Sartre when you were a teenager. That's a flat out lie, because I know what teenage boys, brainy teenage boys, read when they're at, they're not getting girls and they're all filled with angst and like, oh, the world is awful, blah, 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 the teenage bullshit, right? I know that because I was there. So he's lying, but he's lying for a purpose, to establish his bona fides, his intellectual bona fides. I'm smart and you're stupid because you didn't read Sartre when you were a teenager. Which is just, okay. So anyway, let's get to the meat and bones of this shit. See, you got to understand that insofar as I'm scrolling through this damn thing, because goddamn, it's fucking long and just filled with blah, blah bullshit. The 7 points are where it really gets interesting. You got to understand that insofar as history is concerned, you can divide it into, I would say, offhand, I'd say 6 different areas. You could say it's military, economic, political, geopolitical, which is different because there's internal politics and politics between nations or nation states, cultural, and social. The social stuff is the stuff I always find, whatever, that's not important. I mean, I was about to go off on a rant about historiography in universities, but that's besides the point. Let's get to the meat and potatoes. I don't want to be done with this because I want to go and get laid. Number 1, the first point that Niall Ferguson makes: do the Russians manage to take Kiev and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in a matter of 2, 3, or 4 weeks, or never? And he answers, it looks like never. Okay, basically, let me repeat the question so that you understand. Let me give a little bit of context and then read the question, okay? This brings us back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On March 22nd, I proposed that the outcome of that war depended on the answer to 7 questions. Let us now update the answers to those questions. Fair enough. Number 1, do the Russians manage to take Kiev and Ukrainian President Zelensky in a matter of 2, 3, or 4 weeks, or never? And he says, the answer looks like never. And I'll read a little bit of his answer. Although it is possible that the Kremlin has only temporarily withdrawn some of its forces from around Kiev, there is now little doubt that there has been a change of plan. In a briefing on March 25th, Russian generals claimed that it had never been their intention to capture Kiev or Kharkov, and that attacks there had been intended only to distract and degrade Ukrainian forces and pin down. Well, that's the word he wants to know. It's an actual military term, to pin down forces. The real Russian objective was and is to gain full control of the Donbass region in the east of the country. That sounds like a rationalization of the very heavy losses the Russians have suffered since launching their invasion. Okay, so right there, you realize that Niall Ferguson doesn't know anything about military history or basic military strategy. He doesn't. And right there in that answer, and let me explain why. You see, Kiev is an enormous city. I mean, it's just spread out physically. The Russians went in there into the Kiev attack with roughly, it's believed, about 40 to 50,000 troops and the attendant equipment. It is impossible to capture a city that size with 50,000 troops. It's just not physically possible. It's too big, okay? So right there, from the number of forces, you know, and any competent historian ought to know, that it was never the Russians' intention to capture Kiev. It's simply not possible. Why would you use 50,000 troops to invade a city of 3 million, 2.6 million, I believe, actually? You know you can't do it. But if your intention is to launch 50,000 men to make sure that the Ukraine army there of 100,000 men is forced to defend Kiev and stays away from your primary strategic objective, that makes a hell of a lot of sense now, doesn't it? So in that first question, you realize Niall Ferguson doesn't know anything about basic military strategy. I mean, I never went into the army, I mean, I don't know crap about, military tactics. I mean, I'm not a specialist in this shit. And it was pretty obvious from the very beginning. I was in Kiev when it started out, right? And I said on the very first day, they have no intention of taking Kiev. And I didn't even know how many troops they had. I didn't even know how big the city was, okay? I actually didn't. I know Kiev was big, and I'd been going there for so many years, but I never, looked it up on Wikipedia and shit, But I knew that the Russians had no intention, and the reason why, of course, was because I was strolling up and down Kreshchatyk Avenue on the middle of Kiev. Kreshchatyk Avenue is sort of like the Wilshire Boulevard, Oxford Circus kind of street in Kiev, and there's no fighting going on, right? The Russians had no intention of taking the city. They couldn't. They didn't have the manpower. They hadn't knocked out any infrastructure. They hadn't done anything that you would do in preparation for taking a city. And I knew that on the first day. And Mr. Niall Ferguson, Professor Ferguson, doesn't seem to understand that. So he's saying, and the other thing too, his question, how it's phrased, he says, will the Russians manage to take Kiev in 2, 3, or 4 weeks, or never? Well, 2, 3, 4 weeks is just like 30 days. Never is infinite. There is a space of time between that, 90 days, 180 days, 360 days. Now, that notion that it's either you sweep it and take it like in 3 weeks or 4 weeks or never, that's a false dichotomy, because there's this big space in the middle. But again, it just shows Niall Ferguson doesn't know anything about basic military strategy. Okay, number 2. Do the sanctions precipitate such a severe economic contraction in Russia that Putin cannot achieve victory? Now, that question, prima facie, is stupid. And I'll tell you why. Because, you see, listen to the question. Do the sanctions precipitate a severe economic contraction in Russia that makes it impossible for Putin to achieve victory? This is premised on the notion that Russia is, like the West, bankrupt and constantly borrowing money to survive. But the thing is, see, that's not the case in Russia, see? The case in Russia is that they have a very high and very positive balance of payments. And in fact, before the West sold roughly $300 billion, the Russians were sitting on a little nest egg of $650 billion. So even with the Western theft, because that's what it is, and let's not call it otherwise, even with the Western theft of $300 billion of Russian money, the Russians still have $350 billion cash. Actually, it's a little more, because the total just before the war was $684 billion. I think it was $684 billion. I'm almost positive, or 681. 684 billion. And I think it was 287, I want to say. So roughly 400 billion they have in the kitty right now, cash on hand to pay for their army. So it doesn't mean shit. The question is just stupid. Of course they can achieve victory. And of course, the question fails to describe what victory would be. Total annihilation, incineration of the country, they could achieve that without spending any money because they got nuclear weapons. You have to define victory, but let's just say achieving victory would be complete control of the country of Ukraine. Yeah, they definitely have the money because, like I said, Niall Ferguson is premising his question as if he was a Western nation that's bankrupt, but Russia is not bankrupt. And that's interesting. That is a total blind spot on the part of the guy. So that shows a complete lack of understanding of economic history. He doesn't understand the dynamics of economics very clearly. And so now I'm thinking, whenever he talks about economics and economic history, is he basically talking out of his ass? Because here's the issue. See, a historian, you trust him to dig up the information and present you the information. But it seems to me that Niall Ferguson does not present the information so you get a completely false sense of reality, you see? And the way he does this is by structuring his questions in a way that hides the information that he doesn't want his reader to know. You see? Clever move. Question number 3. Does the combination of military and economic crisis precipitate a palace coup against Putin? This is his answer. As I argued 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration is betting on regime change in Moscow. Oh, wait. No, this has been explicit. This has now become explicit. So he was basically right. Look, it wasn't a complicated guess. Everybody knows that the West has wanted regime change ever since, one could argue 2007, the 2007 speech in Munich, but certainly after 2014. So everybody knows that they want regime change. Wait. He doesn't give an answer. There's no doubt in my mind that the US are aiming to get rid of Putin. Yeah, but he doesn't answer the question. Does the combination of military and economic crisis precipitate a palace coup against Putin? So he spends, let's see, two fat paragraphs basically not answering the question because he knows the answer and he doesn't want to tell his audience. The audience is, of course, that'll never happen. There's never going to be a palace coup against Putin for a simple reason. Are there people who envy his position and would like to have his job within the Kremlin? Most certainly. I would argue that all of them in the Kremlin want that because the people who wind up being in the Kremlin or the White House or 10 Downing, they are all highly ambitious and they all dream about having the big job. It's inevitable, okay? So do people in the Kremlin want Putin's job? Definitely, but that's just, like, do you want $1 million? Yes or no? Of course you do. Will they overthrow Putin in a palace coup? And the answer is laughable, no. And here's the thing, see, he's not pointing out two truths. Number one, Putin's approval rating is sky high. The firm, I think it's called Lavada, Lavada or something like that, which has been critical of Putin. I'm not clear if they're anti-Putin or just critical of him, but it's not important. They put out a poll that polled Russians in the cities, and 83% were behind him. 83% approval rating of Putin and what he's doing. Yeah. So do you honestly think that there's going to be a palace coup? I mean, let's assume for the sake of argument that there was a palace coup. Do you think that the coup plotters would have any credibility? They'd probably be hated. They'd probably be chased out of the Kremlin. And Putin, wherever he was, the mob would pull him out and put him back in his chair. Come on. And Niall Ferguson knows this, okay? Because this is really obvious. I mean, this data that I'm telling you, it's not like super secret data. This is all over the place. The fact that he refuses to face this question, and what he does is that he goes on this diversion of talking about, yes, the U.S.'s aim is regime change, but that's not the question. The question is, will there be a palace coup? And the answer is no, never. It ain't gonna happen. And of course, Niall Ferguson doesn't want to say this because if he says it, it would tell his audience that not only is the notion of regime change just foolish, it would show how incredibly popular Putin is. And he doesn't want to emphasize that reality, which is key to the whole problem. Because if you have a population that is very much behind its leader when the leader goes to war, you, as the other nation that might go into a war with this country, I mean, let's call it what it is. If Russia has Putin has a lot of support from the Russian people, hard support, and that would, of course, translate to the people within the Kremlin who would support his policies and move forward with them. You as the West, you as NATO, you as the United States, do you want to get involved with such a war? Of course not, because they are hardcore behind their guy. And so they're going to beat the shit out of you if you go to war with such a country that is so firmly behind this course of action on a popular level. Okay? They have the political support. The West does not have a political support to go to war. That's the real question that's being asked in question number 3. Oh, shoot, man. I should have put a link to the article. It's on Zero Hedge. Sorry, guys. I forgot. It just slipped my mind. And just now as I'm talking to you, I figure you ought to have a link to the article. Go to Zero Hedge. I think they pinned it, okay? It's one of the first articles, okay? It appeared recently because it was posted yesterday on Bloomberg, and I fucking don't read Bloomberg. Why would I read just bullshit from shills like Niall Ferguson? I'd read Zero Hedge like a civilized alternative bastard. Anyway, yeah, go there on Zero Hedge, zerohedge.com. And if you don't know what Zero Hedge is, well, you should learn because that's the only source of viable information right now. Okay, so question 3. You understand what's going on. Niall Ferguson does not want to tell the truth to his readers. He wants to say just the bullshit truth that Biden wants to get rid of Putin, which we've all known since fucking 8 years ago, man. Come on. Okay, number 4. Does the risk of downfall lead Putin to desperate measures? Example, carrying out his nuclear threat. Well, you see, there is no threat of his downfall. There isn't any. It's just ridiculous to say so. It's just bizarre, okay? And again, see, I don't think that Niall Ferguson doesn't know this. I think that he doesn't want to say it to his audience. And so the issue becomes, in his book about the Rothschilds, for instance, do you think that he suppressed information that would have been very pertinent about the Rothschilds? And it's really interesting. You see, there's always been anti-Semitism. Why? For no reason whatsoever. Because, like, for instance, insofar as Putin is concerned, right, the Western media, Niall Ferguson, they all said that, Putin woke up one day and for no reason whatsoever decided that he was going to invade Ukraine. For no reason whatsoever. That doesn't make any sense. When he writes about the Rothschilds, does he also say that for no reason whatsoever, everybody, in Russia or whatever Eastern European shtetl grabbed the pitchfork and went hunting for Jewish people? Is that how it worked? Just for no reason whatsoever? Of course, he's hiding the reasons, and he probably knows them, see? Because he's hiding them here now. Well, so you realize all of a sudden that you can't take him seriously as a historian. On the contrary, you realize that he is a propagandist, a very highfalutin propagandist, but a liar. And you got to understand that. And I'm going to continue going through each and every one of the points here. But I mean, you see where I'm going here. The guy is an absolute liar. He refuses to face reality because he knows that if he tells the truth to his audience will get upset with him. And rather than speak the truth, he prefers his nice, comfy life in wherever the guy lives. His nice, comfy life in the West that's corrupt. It's corrupt because it's based on lies. Lies that are blatant and lies of omission. Just lies. That's why he fits in so neatly in the empire of lies. Anyway, the question number 4, let me answer it. Does the risk of downfall lead Putin to desperate measures? Example, carrying out his nuclear threat. He answers, this is now the crucial question. I deconstructed the question in and of itself. That's completely wrong. And now I'm going to read his answer and I'm going to discuss his answer. This is now the crucial question. Biden and his advisors seem remarkably confident that the combination of attrition in Ukraine and sanctions on Russia will bring about a political crisis in Moscow comparable to the one that dissolved the Soviet Union. But Putin is not like the Middle Eastern despots. He already possesses weapons of mass destruction. Those who prematurely proclaim Ukrainian victory seem to forget that the worse things go for Russia in conventional warfare, the higher the probability rises that Putin uses chemical weapons and a small nuclear weapon. Now, see, right there, you have a problem. Again, this shows conclusively that Niall Ferguson does not understand military tactics or strategy at all. So anything he says about the military, by definition, is suspect and should be discarded. And I'll explain why. He says here, those who prematurely proclaim Ukrainian victory seem to forget that the worse things go for Russia in conventional warfare, the higher the probability rises that Putin uses weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's a lie. It's premised on a lie, the statement, because he says the worst things go for Russia in conventional warfare. Russia is winning, decisively winning. I mean, it's a blowout. And Scott Ritter, who's talked about this quite a bit, agrees with what I said at the very beginning of this war, that this war will prove to be one of the most brilliant wars in military history. And it is. It's unbelievably brilliant. And let me explain why. Because the Russians have completely annihilated the Ukraine's command and control capabilities, their communications abilities. They have completely annihilated their armor. They don't have any armor left. And the Americans are talking about like resurrecting like 50 T-72 tanks to bring them to Ukraine to have them fight. They lost 2,000 tanks here. 50 old tanks. It's just, spitting into the wind, for crying out loud. It's not even a drop in the bucket, okay? It's nothing. The Russians have, if not air superiority, air dominance. They also have weapon systems that have been able to take out all of the fuel depots and the weapons depots, ammunitions depots of the Ukrainian armed forces. They've also, over the last few days, just ratcheted up the heat and wiped out all the refineries, well, the 2 refineries, the one just outside of Odessa and the one near Kremenchuk. And so at this time, the Ukrainian armed forces do not have gasoline. And insofar as mobile warfare is concerned, which is what we are experiencing, this is mobile warfare. This is the kind of warfare that General Patton in the Second World War was a master of, okay? Because it's not about conquering territory, because Niall Ferguson to show his incompetence insofar as military matters are concerned, he thinks that this is a war of conquest. And it is long term, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But see, in the short term, right now, while we're fighting here, this is maneuver warfare. And the point is to not capture territory, but pin down forces and break them apart so that you can gobble up the smaller pieces more easily. The Russians came in with an army of 190,000 soldiers. The Ukrainians had an army just shy of 260,000 combat soldiers, with over 120,000 positioned in the east. That force of 120,000 has been severely degraded, and it's about to be encircled. And the Russians, what did they do? They were able to pin down the other elements of the Ukrainian armed forces with maneuver warfare, the kind of warfare that George Patton was a master of, that Erwin Rommel was a master of. I mean, this is basic World War II stuff, okay? Stuff that you would pick up on Time Life books, right? Niall Ferguson doesn't understand this. He thinks that war is all about conquering territory and blasting it to the Stone Age if it doesn't submit, you know? He doesn't understand. He doesn't know shit about military. And so he premises on the thing that things are going badly for the Russians insofar as the conventional warfare. Now, let's assume for the sake of argument that he knows everything that I'm telling you. And remember, I'm not a specialist in this shit, and I know this shit. I have completely different specialties, and I know this shit. And Niall Ferguson is supposed to be a historian, and you would figure that he would know this basic shit, right? He doesn't know it, or he's pretending he doesn't know it. So let's assume that if he doesn't know it, he's a fool and an incompetent and should, you know, his license to be a practicing historian should be removed, right? And he's British, so he probably does have such a license, so it should be revoked. If he actually thinks what he's writing. If he's lying, then he's just a propagandist. He's trying to convince his audience that the Ukrainians are winning, or if not winning, that the Russians are losing. They're not losing. They're winning decisively in a brilliant war. I mean, I'm sorry, and I'm not saying this to denigrate anybody or to suck anybody's cock. I'm speaking the truth. This is the reality, okay? Like it or not. And there's something else too. You know, when somebody does something cool, like the other day, right here in Volgorod, well, I'm not going to say, you know, point to the correct direction, but the point, right here in Volgorod, I'm in here in Kharkov, and Volgorod is about, I think about 60, 70 kilometers away from here. The Ukrainians staged, you know, a couple of helicopters went in there and blew up like a gas depot. It wasn't important because it was a civilian gas depot, so it didn't affect the military, the Russian military at all. And even if it had been a military depot, it was, in the scheme of things, inconsequential. A mosquito bite, no biggie. But still, that was daring. That was ballsy. I saw video of it, right? You know, some people there saw the helicopters pass by, and they were so low, and it was dark. That's the scariest kind of helicopter flying. Those motherfuckers had balls, man. Balls the size of fucking watermelons, right? And see, you can look at somebody, friend or foe, and say, oh man, that's cool, okay? It doesn't mean that you agree with them. You're just saying, that's cool, okay? The Ukrainians who flew those helicopters, I'd buy them a drink, definitely. The guy who came up with the plan for the Russians, I'd buy him a drink. The commander, yeah, because he knows what he's doing, and he's winning, okay? But Niall Ferguson, like I said, if he doesn't understand the military tactics, then he's a lousy historian who should cash in his historian's license. And if he does understand it and he's lying, he's pandering to his audience. And that makes him dishonest and nobody to be read. Either way, you can't take him seriously. And the question, hang on. Sorry, I should have highlighted this stuff. More importantly, if you believe the use okay. Yeah, again, here's a paragraph I'm going to read in toto, but it shows again, he doesn't know what he's talking about. More importantly, if Putin believes the US and its allies aim to overthrow him, and if Ukraine continues to attack targets inside Russia, as it apparently did for the first time on Thursday night, the Volgorod strike, he seems much more likely to escalate the conflict than meekly to resign the Russian presidency. Well, that's true. I mean, you know, if what you call it, he gets more pressure, of course, Putin and any rational leader would just ratchet up his own heat, you know, fight fire with fire. But see, you know, Ferguson as a historian, you should know this, that the Thursday attack was trivial. I mean, it's just really trivial. It was a one-off. I mean, if it were happening, 3 times per day, now we're talking. Now it's something to be taken seriously. But a one-off, brave as though the pilots indisputably were, it means nothing in the overall scheme of the war. Absolutely nothing. Okay? And he should know that. But he acts like either he doesn't know, which makes him incompetent, or he's lying to his audience to please them and pander to them, which makes him somebody not to be taken seriously. Either way, he's a liar or a fool. You decide. Let me go to the fifth question. Question number 5. Do the Chinese keep Putin afloat, but on condition that he agrees to a compromise peace that they offer to broker? That is a complete failure of geopolitical analysis, a complete failure to understand the relationship between China and Russia. I mean, an absolute and horrific failure to understand the geopolitical reality. Because it seems to imply that there is daylight between China and Russia. There's none whatsoever, okay? Because Niall Ferguson is still operating under the premise that the Chinese and the Russians don't like each other. The Chinese and the Russians have been intimately allied for certainly the last 6 years, and you could argue as far back as 2010. They do joint military patrols in the Far East. You don't do that unless there is intimate contact, intimate liaison, not just at the top, but at every level, okay? Not just Putin and Xi Jinping, not just Lavrov and Wang Yi, all the way to the bottom. They are working hand in glove. And anything that the Chinese say or do is calculated to help the Russians. And the Russians are telling the Chinese what to say, how to offer a peace solution or anything like that. It's not that the Russians are puppeteering China. It's rather China is telling the Russians, hey, bro, how can I help you out? You tell me and I'll do whatever you want. That's the relationship between the two. And Niall Ferguson ought to know that, And frankly, the geopolitical analysts, including Ferguson, including all of them, they should have known for donkey's years that China and Russia are buddies. They should understand, too, that when the Russians invaded Kazakhstan, okay, because they kind of did, okay, and nipped the whole color revolution there in Kazakhstan in the bud, the Chinese at first were totally discombobulated. They were like, what the fuck is going on? Why is Russia just sending, 6,000 troops and getting ready for 50,000 more if need be? Huh? And then when the Chinese saw what the Russians were doing, how they'd stiffened up the president's resolve and his administration and just quieted down and nipped the whole color revolution in the bud. On China Daily, man, I mean, dude, if you want to see some fellatio, you should read China Daily a few days after that whole incident. I mean, China Daily, which is the official mouthpiece of the Chinese government, even though it's state-run media, and it pretends to be separate, like CNN, like MSNBC, that pretend to be separate from the Biden administration, or BBC, that pretends not to be a mouthpiece for Ted Downing. See, these state-run media in China, they were all over the Russians, just praising them to high heaven. Yeah, because the Chinese saw, man, these guys know what the hell they're doing in terms of the military, in terms of doing some hit like this, because they do, okay? So the Chinese, again, a basic incompetence or lying on the part of Ferguson. He either does not understand the relationship between China and Russia, or he's refusing to admit it and pandering to the preconceived notions of his audience and not telling them the truth. And more importantly, it's a truth that his audience ought to know, ought to understand intimately. Because the audience, his audience, Ferguson's audience in the West, in the UK, in NATO countries, EU countries, in the United States, the fact that they do not understand the reality of China-Russia means that they are going to act in ways that will blow up in their face. They don't seem to understand this. And that, it seems to me, is the fault of these courtiers like Ferguson, who suck up to their masters at court, but don't tell them the truth when they need to know the truth. Or maybe they do know the truth and they're just lying to the people so that they can carry out some nefarious action and claim that they were morally justified. Maybe that's it. That's my suspicion, quite frankly, that Ferguson and his ilk, They know the truth. And they spout lies deliberately to propagandize the people so that later the Western regimes, because I'm not going to call them democracy anymore. From here on out, I never will call them democracies because they're not. They're regimes. Now that the Western regimes will carry out some nefarious actions in Eastern Europe based on lies. I think that, frankly, either Ferguson is incompetent or he's part of this empire of lies. And that's basically the thesis of this whole stream. You don't have to watch the rest of it. I'm just going to keep on repeating and pounding away at the same point because this guy, man, he's such a piece of shit. I mean, really, it was really remarkable that one article just like made me wake up and say, Jesus Christ, this guy is a piece of shit. An incompetent or a blatant lying propagandist. One or the other. There's no other possibility here. Let's go on to the next one. Does our attention deficit disorder kick in before any of this? I'll read the question and he has a brief answer to it, so let's go. He says, does our attention deficit disorder kick in before any of this does, any of these previous issues? It is tempting to say that it kicked in after the usual 4-week news cycle the moment Will Smith slapped Chris Rock at the Oscars last weekend. I would venture to pretty much agree. A more nuanced answer is that in the coming months, the support of Western publics for the Ukrainian cause will be tested by persistently rising food and fuel prices, combined with a misperception that Ukraine is winning the war as opposed to just not losing it. Okay. Yeah, this actually, the Bucha so-called massacre, which is not a massacre, it's absolutely a lie. And one of the members of the Ukraine parliament, Ilya, what's his face? I forget and I can't access it, but I posted on my Telegram channel, so go subscribe to my Telegram channel. Ilya, what's his face, said that it was a joint SBU. SBU is the Ukrainian secret police, the guys who want me. It's a joint SBU and MI6 operation. And that would actually make a whole lot of sense. He said that, and then later it came out that the British were the one who vetoed Russia's motion on Monday to have, in the United Nations Security Council, to have an open international investigation into the Bucha incident. And it was Britain who opposed that joint open international investigation, which would make sense if the British were part of the group that did it. And the British, of course, have a long-standing hatred of Russia. I mean, an irrational hatred that is just bizarre. The Brits hate everybody who's better than them, basically, because they're a jealous, petty, small people, filled with resentment and hatred in their hearts. They hated the Germans. That's why Winston Churchill pointlessly went to war with them. And they hate the Russians. I think they fundamentally hate goodness. Yeah. That's what I think. I think that the British fundamentally hate goodness because I think at heart, especially the elites in Britain, they're fundamentally filled with evil. I mean, come on, they're all like buggering each other senseless at Eton and stuff, you know? That kind of sodomy, relentless sodomy from the age of 13 on, it's bound to pervert people and make them just disgusting, morally reprehensible, like this Ferguson fellow. So anyway, yeah. Now, and what is the seventh question? What is the collateral damage? Okay, let me read his answer. The world has a serious and worsening inflation problem, with central banks seriously behind the curve. The longer this war continues, the more serious the threat of outright stagflation, high inflation with low or no or negative growth. This problem will be more severe in countries that rely heavily on Ukraine and Russia, not just for energy and grain, but also for fertilizer. That's all nominally true. Okay, but he fails to understand the collateral damage. The collateral damage is that the West is over. The Western dominance, the unipolar world is completely over. And he doesn't talk about that at all. I mean, and then he goes on to talk about statistically figuring out how long this war will last, which is just dumb, I mean, it's just flat out stupid. To say that statistically you can figure out how war will end, and statistically you can figure out if a leader will endure or not. doesn't make any goddamn sense, okay? Because every war, every leadership is different, okay? And so to rely on statistics to give you an answer to such historical questions, that's just lazy and incompetent and designed to make you, by putting, I mean, he actually has graphs. How long do wars last? And he has graphs, man. It's just stupid. And, it's just an attempt by Ferguson to shore up how scientific he is, how rational and educated, and just above you, quite frankly. He reads Sartre. Oh man, this guy, man. I mean, I gotta say, I mean, it's rare that I read a single article by somebody, and just a single article, and my opinion